Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we are going to look at managers, specifically the differences between stick and ball sports managers, MMA managers, and boxing managers. But first, let's check in with our host and see how he's been doing. John, what's going on?
Not much. I just got a cat on my lap, so I got to be very careful because it's I can't disturb her while I do the show. I gotta continually pet her while I do the show. That's her rules.
What's her name?
The Isla.
Isla. It's a very pretty name. I like that.
Yes.
I didn't picture you as a cat person, but now I will forever have the image of you with a cat in your lap.
It's like I've said, it's an abusive relationship. I give all the love to the cat. She doesn't care.
That's the typical human cat relationship.
Yes, I guess so.
So tell me about the typical fighter manager relationship. What is an MMA manager supposed to do?
Well, a manager in combat sports, the idea of a manager is they are supposed to guide your career. They're supposed to help you choose fights, the best fights for your career, and also helps you negotiate contracts and deals to make money. So that's their job, their basic job.
Is there a difference between a manager and an agent?
Well, in the world of entertainment, there's a big difference. A manager is someone that guides your career, that helps you make choices to improve have a better career, like longevity. Does this role improve your image? Does this role going to lead to better roles? An agent is someone that goes out and finds jobs for you, goes out and procures like sponsorship and gets a piece of the action for doing that. But they're not worried about your long-term career. That's what an agent. But a manager and an agent in MMA and boxing, those are used interchangeably. In fact, they're by legally defined that way under the Ali Act and various state regulations. So there's no difference. Those can be used interchangeably in MMA and boxing.
Can you tell me what the difference is in, say, stick and ball sports and MMA and combat sports, that type management? Because I seem to recall there being a lot of uproar over MMA managers and boxing managers not having to have a degree. Can you explain that?
Well, in the stick and ball sports, they all have associations, right? Mm-hmm. And those associations have collective bargaining agreements with all the players and the leagues. They also have rules set down that says that if you're going to be an agent for a player, you have to meet a minimum, and they have all these rules that apply before you can be eligible to represent a player. In other words, they have a barrier to entry for agents. There's no barrier to entry for a boxing or MMA manager. In fact, Lou Margolis, the promoter, told me a great story once about a fighter he had who had no agent or manager. When he called him and when he showed up, he said, "I want you to speak to my agent." He goes, "I didn't think you had a manager." He said, "Why don't you speak to my manager?" "I didn't think you had a manager." "No, I just got him." And it was this taxi cab driver that he hired on the way there. Oh. So I thought that very much sums it up, that anybody can be a manager. Your cousin, that's why you have some of the worst managers in sports there. But for stick and balls, agents, they have standardized rules in each of the leagues that you have to meet these minimums to represent people.
And one of those minimums is definitely a degree, right? At least a bachelor's.
For some of them, it's a degree, but for other, I'm not sure all of them require a degree. But there's a test. You can't have a criminal record. There's a background check, and there's also a maximum. There's a set amount what you get as a percentage, and it's much lower than you'd see in boxing and MMA. It's like 3%, I think, for a lot of the guys, because of the CBA. There's very little negotiating for a lot of those agents.
Yeah.
For your first contract, because it's set down what your starting wages are going to be for rookie players. Where they earn it is when you are a veteran player worth something, and they know how to time the market and play the market against the various teams. Then you see baseball players and top QBs getting $50 million a year, and then they go, "Okay, that guy had someone that knew what they're doing."
I always go back to Ken Pavia, because Ken Pavia used to charge an insane amount. 20 to 25%, depending on the client. That was his fee. 20 to 25%. That is insane. And you're talking 3 to 5% over there. Boy, these fighters just don't even know.
Well, legally, a manager can charge up to 33 and a third percent, which is an insane amount. But that's a lot of that has to do with managers. The position of managers should be much more powerful in the past, especially in boxing. Promoters took over after a while because they put all these regulations to contain managers because they had so much power. And then they made promoters more powerful. But, so very few managers are making anything like that. But the ones that do make a high percentage, usually they're doing something for it, that they get that percentage.
Since we are talking about percentages and money, what is their fiduciary duty?
You act in your beneficiary, which is your client's interest, rather than serving your own interest. That's what a fiduciary is. So when a manager's named a fiduciary, you're required by law to manage their career or or negotiate their contracts to their benefit, not your own. So all your decisions have to be at what is to their benefit, not your own.
Now, I touched on this with Ken Pavia. Talk about the managers in the old days, your Monty Coxes and people like that.
Well, it was interesting. If you go back far enough in MMA, it was a completely different landscape because the UFC hadn't dominated and conquered the space yet, right? And so you had all these other promotions could pay relatively comparable wages, maybe not for a few guys that, the Chuck Liddells and stuff after Tough, you couldn't match. But even like a King of the Cage could offer comparable wages for a one-time show for a lot of fighters. Then there's, Rumble on the Rock and Elite XC at one time. And Affliction was paying more than the UFC and Strikeforce. And so there was a lot more options back then. So managers then operated a lot more like boxing managers, where the purpose was to guide I shouldn't say all managers, because a lot of fighters just wanted to still just be in the UFC, especially through the Ultimate Fighter program. But for other guys, you want to manage your fighter's career like you would a boxer. Is you want to play promotions against each other to get the best deal. So Monty Cox didn't guarantee. He would often, not have guys sign with the UFC or try to get them out of the UFC where they'd make more money. Robbie Lawler was making a lot of money outside the UFC. Or he would play. He got a great deal for Matt Hughes because he got Bodog. Matt Hughes, the fight out of his contract, got Bodog to offer him a lot of money. Kind of backfired because apparently, UFC went to Matt Hughes and said, hey, we want to give you a lifetime guarantee with the promotion. And part of it was I guess he dropped Monty Cox as part of the deal. But that was the Monty Cox's game back then. And Ken Pavia was the same, that you use M1, use these promotions to give your fighters leverage so they could make more money. And then you'd get a bigger cut of that, of course. But that dried up as the competition dried up. And now that there's just a few big promotions, all of these really rock hard coercive contracts that are very, exclusive and hard to get out of, it's harder to play the promotions against each other. And so that style of old promoter dried up. The other thing the old promoters did, like Monty Cox, is they would operate as promoters themselves sometimes. They'd have their own promotions. You see that today again, but it's a little different the way they do it. But back then, Monty Cox would often as his own promotion, and he'd use his own promotions as an alternative to like the UFC and other promotions, so he could get his fighter a better deal.
Talk about Monty Cox and the way he did Tim Sylvia.
Well, I think you're probably referring to an old article that our man, Kid Nate Wilcox wrote. And I kind of disagree with Nate on part of that because Monty Cox did a great job of when he got Tim Sylvia left the UFC, he had been the UFC champion. He had just lost a fight for the interim championship against Big Nog after Randy Couture had holed out and they'd made a new title. And so he had asked to get let go, and he did. At the time, he was making like $125,000, $150,000 a fight with the UFC. And so he got a much, much bigger deal with Affliction. And this is where I disagree with Nate Wilcox. Like, one big fight, Nate said, doesn't make up for a career. And I'm like, this is the fight business. If you can get 4 or 5 times as much in one fight, take it, because you want to save brain cells. Get out of the business. And so he got Tim Sylvia a deal for $800,000 against Fedor Emelianenko. If he would have won, his next fight would have been like 1.2 or 1.3 million.
Wow.
But he didn't win. He did also have in the contract, he had another fight with Affliction for $500,000. Now, this is where Monty made a big mistake. to keep Tim Sylvia busy, he booked him for his own show against Ray Mercer, and probably was one of the worst decisions, because if you're going to put Tim Sylvia against anyone, you don't want to put him against someone with quick hands and power. And that's what he booked, a real boxer, because Tim Sylvia beats MMA guys with his striking, because they weren't good strikers back then for heavyweights. He could hold them at their distance. For Ray Mercer, Tim Sylvia was someone walking through water. And I remember talking to Ray Mercer about this, that he thought it was one of the funniest things ever, because that guy, Tim Sylvia, had nothing for him. I think he said something like, it was like fighting someone that his opponent was in the pool and I wasn't.
Yeah. That's
how slow Sylvia was to him. And then, and then he made the whole timber joke about him falling over, how big he was. But that was the terrible. And because of that, but he didn't really cost Tim Sylvia money, because the Affliction deal that was going to pay him $500,000 fell apart, because Affliction fell apart. So in some ways you'd say, man, you made a terrible mistake getting your fighter beat up this way and losing out on this $500,000 payday at Affliction. But that deal would never happen, because Josh Barnett failed his drug test. And so the third Affliction event never took place.
Man, the good old days. What happened to the sponsorship procurement manager?
After the drying up of the competition, the big thing managers did, because they couldn't play the promotions against each other, because the UFC would get very upset when you tried to play the promotions against each other. They took their, Sam Spira, the representative of Randy Couture, is no longer really doesn't manage people in the UFC, because they got upset that he did that. Jeff Clark with Roger Huerta, UFC does not like when you play people against each other with them. And so managers stopped trying to get the promotions to drive up the price for their fighters. And plus the other promotions couldn't compete with the UFC anymore. And so what they did is the UFC gave them a place on the broadcast that they could sell sponsorship revenue to. And this is the era of where the sponsorship revenue is great. Everybody got a T-shirt deal. Everybody's wearing a terrible Affliction shirt or some other brand. Everybody had their logo, the shorts covered in logos. They had the banner up in their corner. And so a lot of fighters were making multiples what they were with their sponsorship and then what they were in their fight purses. And so they in some ways they thought it was worth it. Like, you know what? I won't hassle the UFC for more pay on my purse, because I'm making so much more just being in the UFC. And the managers that became specialists were, all they did is Jeff Clark had a whole team that would try to find various, they would be on the phone all the time working with attorneys and stuff to get their deals, special, as many sponsorship deals as they could for their fighters under contract. And then there's other managers that were hired directly by brands, right? And then they would parcel out those sponsorship and they would take a cut of that. And that's a little bit, that's where the fiduciary duty kind of breaks down. And that seems a little bit of a conflict of interest, because your duty as a manager is to get your fighter the best deal possible. But when you're representing also the sponsor, your deal for them is, well, I get to make more money by giving my fighter a worse deal. And so that you saw some conflicts with that. I thought it was a little sleazy by a lot of managers back then. But that was what the sponsor procurement manager, but then the sponsorship tax and eventually the Reebok deal basically put an end to that. You don't really see managers operating that way anymore.
I'm going to take a little sidestep here. What about handlers? And the reason I ask this is because the Kawas used to have a handler guy for Jon Jones. But could you talk about a little bit about handlers? Now, I don't know if anybody in the UFC has one. I know that guy in particular, he left the Kawas like 6-7 years, maybe even longer. It's about 7 years ago.
You might have to be more clear on which guy that is, because there's also, remember they used to have Wayne Harriman. Wayne Harriman with them.
No, this was somebody else. I can't reveal his name, but he did work very closely with Jon Jones. And, he did the same thing, though. He worked as a procurement manager and he worked sort of as a handler. I mean, they hired him specifically for Jon Jones.
Well, Jon Jones is a special case. And so there was also rumors that Jon Jones had a piece of first row management for years. Ooh. I don't know if that ended up being true or not, but that was the word that he had a piece. And also there was the word that he did not have to really pay the Cowas anything because his name being attached to him was what got him the other clients that he used them to sell. And that seems to be kind of true because remember, he said for years, those guys have never been negotiating my deals.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
And so, but the other thing with the Cowas, remember that they were also, Dana White would not deal with them. And so the Cowas had to get intermediary in Wayne Harriman, who is an interesting guy. He's a good friend of Dana White, the Fertittas, but he also used to be a member of the Buffalo Mafia and was investigated for drug smuggling and with the Hell's Angels and possibly was a confidential informant. We don't know the full details of that yet. But so he is an interesting background, an organized crime figure. But he would negotiate Jon Jones deals with the Fertittas and Dana White, and they would, instead of seeing the Cowas, they would deal with that guy directly, and he would negotiate it, even though his name wasn't on or part of the first row management. He wasn't a partner or anything there, but they would have to pay him to go do this for him.
Let's talk about managers maximizing the platform.
Okay, when we mean the platform, we mean basically being on the UFC as a platform. The UFC is giving you a platform to increase your brand awareness and make fans and be more known. And this is kind of the evolution of where the business has gone over the years, because you had first the guys playing the promotions against each other, that dried up. Then you had people procuring management sponsorship, but that really dried up with the Reebok deal. And so the next step was we have guys like Adi Attar, and he's got Conor McGregor. It was hard to negotiate with the UFC to get, there was no leverage because you're tied to the UFC and there wasn't a lot of competition out there for you to get a big purse because you can't leave the UFC except for the McGregor fight, the Mayweather fight, which was a specialty. But what you can do is say, I'm going to use the UFC, and his is probably the most extreme version because he's like, I'm going to use the UFC to now to market my brand of Proper 12 whiskey. And so that's what he did. He goes, I can't really negotiate like a boxing cut where I get 50, 60, 70% of the revenue I bring in, but I can use this access to the UFC that I can now sell something else. And that blew up, made a ton of money. And you see Dustin Poirier's kind of done the same, right? With his hot sauces. Thank you. And then, there's other guys trying to do the same, like Sean O'Malley with marijuana. And there's other guys trying to use the platform that I've become famous because of the UFC. So I'm going to start a podcast. I'm going to start all these endeavors outside the UFC, outside where I'm not using my appearance on the fight itself, where you would normally make your money. I'm going to use the fame to gain access or to sell stuff outside the UFC. And that's where guys like Tim Simpson seems to specialize in, Adi Attar, who've taken really a strong advantage of that. But we talked about in a previous episode, the contracts have changed. And so I don't know if even this brand of manager is going to last longer, be around much longer, because they now introduced language that says the UFC owns the rights to inventions and stuff, products that you make. Why under UFC contract? Some question about it, does it have to have a UFC logo or not? But it's strong. The language is vague enough that it probably will give the UFC a good cut of all those if people come up with products while under UFC contract.
Insane. Absolutely insane. So you mentioned that there was a rumor that Jon Jones actually owned a piece of first row management. There is a similar rumor. I mean, it's almost widely confirmed because
I think it is confirmed
that Conor owns part of Paradigm. Is that true?
At least the MMA branch, he probably owns a Paradigm. At least he gets a cut of it because he was taunting. People probably remember taunting Michael Bisping with the fact that I get a cut of your what you earn.
Yes, that's where I was going with that. So
that seems to confirm that rumor.
Okay. Why are some managers called brokers?
Well, there's a lot of criticism of managers, and when you think of the worst managers, the ones that everybody criticizes, they're usually the ones we would call brokers. And what brokers are, a broker isn't a manager. A broker works for an entity, in this case, the promotions, to acquire talent for them, to go out and get, they're basically seeking talent for them. They're not representing the fighters per se. They're representing the promotion to get them fighters. And that flips the dynamic because your interest now is not in protecting the fighter and making them make the most. Your interest is making sure the promotion is happy, because they're going to keep you employed by sending them, letting you signing more fighters that you send their way, and then you get a percentage of all their contracts. And so now you're no longer working quite away in a quality nature. You're working in a quantity because you get a piece of all these fighters, and it's really disturbing in some ways because it's also there. It's also scary in some ways because there's situations. Let's say the UFC will favor these brokers, and so in many ways these brokers can get you a better deal because the UFC wants those brokers to get their fighters a better deal because they want fighters to sign with those guys because they know those guys will cause less problems. And so a good example would be, and we're not going to use names, but let's say you have a manager that's giving the UFC a hard time, right? And the UFC, Dana White might even say, listen, you should go talk to this other manager. Your manager's a joke. Go talk to this other manager. And so you go talk to the manager Dana White sends you to, which is one of the brokers. And that manager says, I'll talk to the UFC. And he comes back and goes, I got you 10%. The UFC will give me 10% more than what they were going to give what your manager got. Now, that sounds like, my God, this manager did a great job. He got me a better deal. But the truth is, the UFC, because they control the market, they can pay a lot more than they normally do, right? Mm-hmm. But they're like, we didn't want to pay, because we have monopoly, we didn't want to pay to that other manager too much. But because now you're going to sign to a manager we like and who's going to cause less problems and make you do what we want to do, we're willing to give this bump up. It's much less than what we could possibly really should pay you, but it's more with the other manager because it'll make you sign with that guy. And so now this manager looks like a much better manager than everybody else, and other fighters will probably sign with him, and the UFC will be happy.
Do managers actually try? Do they give a shit about their fighters?
I think there's several managers that do, but there's a lot of managers. Obviously, there's several managers that all they care about is keeping the UFC happy because the more the fighter, that way they offer is access to the UFC. You sign with me, not because I'm going to represent you, give you the best representation, but because you sign with me, the UFC likes me, I can get you in the door to the UFC, right? Mm-hmm. Or like I said before, they can give you a slightly better deal, or they can give you a title fight faster because the UFC likes them. It's not that they're going to give you they're not going to give you, these guys are not going to go to the ground, they're not going to go to the matches for you to get you a massive deal that you deserve. But because the UFC likes them, they can give you advantages that other managers can't. But the other managers, so the problem with the other managers is the UFC, and this is not, let's say you're not dealing with the UFC, because there's just a handful of promotions, you've got to keep these small number of promotions happy because otherwise you're out of business. So does it help even if you want to do the best for your fighter, does it help them to piss the UFC off so much that they won't work with you and punish your fighter as a result, or punish your other fighters? Let's say you represent 10 fighters, and because you're pushing so hard doing your fiduciary duty for this one fighter, they're basically going to punish all your other fighters. Well, that's a really chilling effect because you're not like, I got to also be worried about my other fighters. Can I risk pushing that hard on one fighter and then hurt all my other fighters? And so because of the power, the one-sided nature of the relationship, even managers that would like to do more for their fighters, I think they feel that they can't. They really can't.
What happens to managers that upset the UFC?
Well, we got a lot of examples. One thing you notice, they're not around anymore, right? This
is true.
The managers that did the best job of playing promotions against each other, and we talked about, Monty Cox was actually one of those guys that did that. Mm-hmm. Zinkin from Zinkin Entertainment, the old school, they don't really represent many people anymore, right? Jeff Clark is out of the business, I believe, and he's the one that played, guided Roger Horton to leave the UFC.
Is Crazy Bob Cook still doing stuff?
I think he quit. He's done with the business, or he's in the business, but no longer representing or training people at all. So
yeah, but he actually served a dual role there because he worked very closely with Zinkin and actually negotiated some of the deals. I know that for.
Oh yeah, he worked at AKA and Zinkin together. So yes. That was the whole part of it. Zinkin and AKA were tied together. That they would, a lot of the fighters they would represent were at AKA in the early days.
They had a very unique relationship, right?
They did, yes. But they also, and it's kind of a conflict of interest. They also they also helped Strikeforce out a lot. Now, that's a conflict of interest in many ways because there should be a separation between a manager and a promoter. But from their point of view, at the same time, it's like we're building some sort of minor competitor to the UFC to give our fighters more leverage. Because without that, our fighters have no options. Just go to the UFC. We're trying to get at least another option out on the market. So it's, it is a conflict of interest, but it's a little more understandable in a space where there's not much competition. But the other ones too is like, you look at Markel Martin that was representing Ngannou.
Mm-hmm.
He's pretty much out of the business now. UFC would not negotiate him with him. So I think Ngannou basically dropped him because he couldn't negotiate with the UFC because UFC refused to talk to him. And then all of his other fighters have basically left because the UFC was cutting them out of the UFC.
Wow.
And so that's the way they work. So you see that time and time again with anybody that tried to play multiple promotions against each other to increase, especially the UFC against another promotion, to increase their pay. Sam Spera, that we talked about him. Those guys are persona non grata in the UFC, and so the UFC doesn't talk to them. And then the next step is if the UFC is not negotiating, if you're not negotiating for me with the UFC, like Masvidal said to Kawa and Jon Jones, if you're not doing the negotiations for me, what am I paying you for?
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Sam Spira there, and I feel like we should let everybody know that was Randy Couture's manager for a while, an attorney. He sought out a good one, but like John said, he couldn't get the. Well, he
did. He's the guy that took the gamble.
Yeah.
That guided Randy to basically challenge the UFC to get out of his contract to go fight Fader.
Yeah.
And that's when there was a whole back and forth lawsuit, and because it ended up being. The lawsuit went back to Vegas and it was going to drag on, and Randy was at 40 and he'd spent $500,000. There's a possibility he would have won, but he's like, at my age, I can't burn through this money and wait this long, which was the UFC's intent.
Do the fighters really need managers? Bobby Green says that he's self-managed now, and Paul Daly was very famous for that. He self-managed literally his whole career almost.
Oh, and Sean O'Malley.
Sean O'Malley's another one. There's a few out there that are self-managing. So do fighters need managers?
I do think some fighters need management, especially the fighters that are going to play. If you're a big enough fighter that you can play promotions against each other, you probably want someone that knows the industry a little bit, that knows the market value within the industry and get you a better deal, right? But for the large majority of fighters in the UFC, the UFC's pay is tiered. It's set. You already know what you're going to get. You know what you're going to get when you come onto the UFC. You know what you're going to when you go on to the Ultimate Fighter. The contract's already drawn out, so you know what you're going to make. You know what they pay on a second tier contract, the second contract, the third contract. All that stuff is mostly already dictated. A manager might help you in a sense like, now's the time to negotiate on this fight and not wait to the next one. But a lot of fighters have been in the business long enough and know enough people and seen how it works that they also know that after 2 wins in a row, I should go renegotiate, right? That they're going to want to negotiate. I can get a bump up to the next tier. But everything is a formula. So for a large number of fighters, it doesn't really make sense to have a manager, right? The other thing is the managers no longer, like we said, they don't get the sponsorship. In many ways, the UFC is the person providing the sponsorship for a lot of fighters. They're the ones that have deals with sponsors that they're going to hire fighters, that they're going to say, the sponsors go to the UFC and say, we have 20% of the budget we're going to pay you that we want to go to fighters to show up for events and wear our brands. And so the UFC is the one going to give those deals to their fighters. The managers aren't. So a manager still works if you have a big enough name where they can get you deals outside the UFC, and there's some that still do that, and that you plan and are willing and you're intent on basically testing the market, or at least pretending to test the market enough to try to get a better deal. But I think, surprisingly, Paulo Costa's girlfriend might have done a pretty good job. That she, it sounds shocking. It sounds like an idiot move. You hired your girlfriend. But unlike other managers, she doesn't have other clients, right?
Right.
So they can't use the threat like, oh, we're gonna screw over all your other clients now, hurt them because we don't like your moves. No, she's just representing this one person. So the threat is real that we are going to leave the UFC. So she read the contract, saw that his contract's up. They could play the game like we legitimately have the threat and the option, because we're a big enough name that there's possibilities outside the UFC. We can play that game, and she did it. And you see the same thing with Nate Diaz's agent. Actually, he's an attorney, but opposite as manager, I guess you'd say the same. They're very similar. And when you represent your fighter, you're basically a manager in boxing and MMA. He did the same because he only represents Nate Diaz, and so those are if you can find someone to represent you and no one else, you're probably in a better situation. But for the vast majority of fighters, it's hard to say how much they really do for you.
This is the part of the show where John's going to give us a campfire story. So I want you to tell me about the story from 2009 about managers trying to make a union.
Well, it's kind of funny because managers can't form a union. They're not
Right.
they're not employees, but apparently that was the idea. Back in 2009, UFC 100, that is when they first introduced, you remember, the sponsorship tax.
Mm-hmm.
They radically increased it. And that ripples through the management. Now, the year before, in 2008, the managers, not the manager, but the strike for Elite XC went under, and they kept everybody under contract. And the managers to those fighters were upset because now, like, we're trapped in these contracts, but there's a market out there. We can get our fighters better deals. We can get out on the market now. And so they went to Rob Macy of the MMA FA, right? And back then it was, just a thought. And they got him to file a lawsuit to try to get them to break the contracts, to declare their fighters free agents. But nothing, it was negotiated peace because elite assets ended up being bought by Strikeforce. So Strikeforce acquired those contracts. But apparently some manager, agent got the idea that since Macy was arguing that we should get the fighters to organize as an association to work together, they said, instead of having the fighters organize, one of the managers did. And my understanding, it was Ken Pavia that thought of this, but I don't know, it could be another one, but this is that we should get the management should work together and we could run the business, right? And apparently it was Ed Soros and Zinkin and, Bob Coot and Zinkin and I can't remember the other big names at the time, like 6 or 7 of them. Dan Lambert at America Top Team. I think he did a podcast where he talked about the managers trying to make a union at some point. So, but anyways, they were supposedly going to get organized. And the whole point was we were going to work together to fight back against the UFC for the sponsorship tax. And it didn't. After one meeting, the whole thing fell apart because apparently they had a spy. One of the other ones called Dana White. And he called in and said, "What the hell are you guys doing?" And the whole thing broke apart. And then, Ken Pavia was persona non grata.
Something else came from this. The infamous video of Dana cursing Loretta Hunt because she was the one that reported on this. And so he made this video where he cursed her up one side and down the other. He referred to Kim Pavia as a homophobic slur multiple times, and it enraged GLAAD. And so GLAAD came out, and they forced a public apology from the UFC over that.
Well, it's one correction. It wasn't about this the agent, the union's agent. It was about the UFC basically blocking managers from going in the backstage. And there was
That's right.
Yep. But close up, there was some, and what's funny is there were some minor mistakes, not minor mistakes, but minor, there were some minor errors in Loretta Hunt's report, but the general gist of it was correct, but it wasn't her fault. She's getting information from other sources telling her, and she's just trying to interpret it. But because of that, the UFC instantly, Dana White targeted those mistakes and basically said she was, the whole thing was a lie, but there was some truth that they were changing their, but talking to multiple people at the time that there was, that the general gist of her report was pretty accurate. Mm-hmm. And it is amazing though how many fans, and this just shows the difference of the world right now, how many fans instantly sided with Dana White back then on that. And I found that disturbing at the time.
Yes, right? Does the UFC operate as a manager with their sponsorship deals?
In many ways, they do. And if you read the Muhammad Ali Boxing Reform Act and a lot of the state regulations about when they define a manager, the purpose of a promoter under those definitions is basically to promote the fight. That's the promoter's job. But the UFC operates in a way where they not only do they promote the fight, they find you the opponent. That's technically a manager's job, is to find you the opponents, right? They also find you sponsorship and other outside endeavors that you're signed to. That's also a manager's job, not a promoter. So in many ways, the UFC has taken over the job of what is a manager does in boxing.
we have said the B word, boxing. Break it down. Why does boxing management seem so much better?
Well, it's hard to say. I'd say better is, subjective, because there's a lot of terrible boxing management, and they have a long history of terrible, crooked management. But one thing better about boxing is they've now put a bunch of regulations and laws to fix some of the horrible, horrible management they used to have with the Ali Act we brought up before, that you can't have a conflict of interest. There's a firewall between being a promoter and a manager. So in boxing, you can't operate as a manager and a promoter or have compensation unless it's for a non-title or non-major fight. So if it's under 10 rounds, you can operate as a manager and a promoter. And the basic theory to that is for a lot of managers, because if you're managing a fighter and you need to build them up and you can't find opponents, they would often stage the fights themselves just to give their guys some ring time, right? And so that theory is you're allowed to do that. Now, some managers still try to take advantage of that by let's say they have a problem with their fighter and they don't want to lose them, they try never to give them more than an 8-round fight, because then they're not violating the Ali Act. But that's not nearly the problem it used to be. So you don't have the problem today in boxing like you did when Don King was around. Mm-hmm. Famous case, Don King. Mike Tyson sued him, right? And he sued him because, basically Don King, he thought was stealing money, but also because Don King had given him 2 puppet managers to work with. And Don, Horn and Holloway, 2 guys. So Don King, Mike Tyson had sued him for like $300 million. What's interesting about that in that lawsuit, if you look through it, the lawsuit, Mike Tyson, all the purses he made, all the money that was generated in those fights, Mike Tyson is arguing he should have made like 50 to 60% of all the money that was generated. And he claims, Don King ripped him off. And I think I added up once, and Don King still paid him like 37, 40% of the revenue.
Wow.
So still way more than what you would see in MMA, but he was getting ripped off. But Don King famously would have his son manage fighters, or have multiple people manage a fighter, and then they would send money back to him. So those kind of crooked deals have ended. But also management in boxing, the manager they're not as beholden to promoters, right? Promoters have power, but there's multiple promoters, and because of the sanction orders are separate, there's a purpose to them. Their purpose for the major management is not only to go over the contracts and negotiate deals, but also to guide your career, to pick opponents, to pick like, when are you ready to fight a certain opponent? Which opponent's going to set you up for the bigger fight, right? Which opponent? So like, Devin Haney kind of manages himself with his dad.
Yep.
But they have to make a choice. Do they want to sign with a promoter or be independent? They decided recently to sign a 3-fight deal with Top Rank. Now, if that might have been a risk, but he got a big purse against 2 big purses against Kambosos in the rematch. He could have made more though, and probably somewhere else. But because of that, now he gets a pay-per-view event versus Lomachenko and gets to be a free agent again. And so stuff like that is where a manager guides their fighter to choose when do you want to sign a longer-term contract with the promoter, when you want to go short-term, when do you want to challenge certain fighters, because then it gives you the leverage of raising the ranks or getting a title that you can then leverage for a bigger fight. So there's much more swimming through the seas of the industry for a manager to guide a boxer through in boxing. So they have much more importance there. What's interesting is management used to be much more powerful. The early days, if you go back to the early 20th century, you notice the promoters were afterthoughts. The guys that controlled boxing were the managers, Rickert and all these other guys, Tex Winters and all these guys that guided, that basically owned the heavyweight crown, because they dictated the terms. The promoter would just bid and hold one event, and there'd be an afterthought. But because of the corruption cases, because of regulations that came in, there was limits put on promoters, and that's when an opening for guys like Don King and Arum to then take over the sport. And then the promoter became the major force in boxing. And then we see MMA imitating boxing, seeing what they did. And though MMA, it's basically the promoters are almost the entire entity of the sport, namely the UFC. But the promoters like UFC and Bellator, they control everything. The sanctioning organizations, the UFC, they operate as the promotion. They operate as a sanctioning organization, and in many ways, they operate as the manager by determining, dictating to the fighter who they're going to fight, and also dictating, sponsorship deals and other outside deals.
What about guys like Al Haymon? He's an interesting character to me because he sort of oversees, maybe has a guiding hand. I don't know. Yeah, I think you said advisory to me earlier today. And that's an interesting role to have because Gervonta Davis has been saying since October of last year that he is now self-managed. But guys like Al Haymon sort of help guide them a little bit. Can you sort of explain that a little?
Well, Al Haymon calls himself an advisor. And there's some question, does he break the Ali Act? Now, over the years, he's now come out and said, basically, I operate as a manager. I'm a manager. I fall under management rules. But the argument for a while was, as an advisor, he didn't violate the firewall between promoter and manager, because the case that was presented against him by Top Rank and Golden Boy was he's managing these boxers, but also because he works with PBCs operating as a promoter, and that's a violation of the Ali Act. Now, the one reason he's not violating the Ali Act, the one major reason, is complaints of violating the Ali Act can't come from other promotions. The Ali Act does not protect promotions. It protects boxers. So the only ones that could accuse Haymon of violating the Ali Act would be his own boxers. And since none of them filed charges, right, he's not violating the Ali Act. They are not upset with the services he's providing. And as you know, a lot of boxers seem to be very happy with what he does, because his business model, in many ways, is like he tries to make a big a promotion as possible. But his business model is, I get money on the back end from you, the boxers, because I get a percentage. So what I want to do is get you the biggest purse as possible. And under that business model, it's hard for a lot of boxers to get upset because, it's like, well, maybe he is violating the Ali Act. I don't really care because he's getting me the biggest purse possible.
All right. I have two final questions for you. The first one, going back to when Mike Tyson first got out of jail, he set himself up with the biggest purse of all time back then. He got a $26 million purse to fight Peter McNeely right out of jail. How did that come together?
Well, that purse he got that's part of that lawsuit deal, actually, when he got out of Don King negotiated that. In fact, we were talking about his bogus management was there. Horn and Holloway, who ended up suing after that because he didn't want to cut them in. But Don King put this great deal together, but Don King also got a big chunk of that purse.
Okay. And my second question, my final question, talk a little bit about Floyd Mayweather, because he is an entity unto himself, self-promoted, self-managed. Just lay his career path out to us as it unfolded, because you tell it better from the financial angle.
Well, yeah, he's an interesting case because, it really is a unique case. So it's hard to compare any other fighter to him, and because he came at a special time, and he did something that no other fighters did. But he developed under he signed with Top Rank, and people think he was doing nothing, but he was actually a draw as a fighter. He was selling his earlier fights with Top Rank before he went off on his own. He was selling, with a Gotti and stuff, like 300,000 buys, right? So these were very successful pay-per-views at the time, but he felt that Top Rank was underestimating his potential, right? And so he famously, there's a deal, he had some portion of his contract that said he could buy it out for $700,000. I believe my understanding is he went to Haymon, and Haymon advanced him the money to help him pay for that. And then that's where Haymon was his advisor. And you can't, Mayweather, Haymon plays a big part of this, because I think Haymon also understood the vast potential, because Haymon comes from the touring business, the vast potential money that was out there in the fight business that wasn't being tapped into. And this is something there's just on one example what Haymon does. If you look at the secondary market for tickets, right? Secondary market is you you buy your tickets from the arena, and then a bunch of scalpers put on the secondary market and jack up the price, right? Well, Haymon knows to set aside a bunch of these tickets for the second, and then so that him and the fighters can sell this on the secondary market, make a lot more than what they would just from the gate. And so there's stuff like that. These little things were pieces of, like Mayweather getting pieces of the concession stand and stuff probably came from Haymon advising. And so he paid off his contract. He was making millions with Top Rank. He bought out his contract for $700,000. He agreed to a fight with Oscar De La Hoya because in Oscar, again, the people that said that there was no appeal to Floyd Mayweather, who famously changed his identity to Money at that time, people said there was no appeal to Floyd Mayweather. Well, Oscar chose him for a reason, because obviously there was interest in Floyd Mayweather. But as the business of boxing works, if you get into a big fight, often when you have two superstars, 2 + 2 does not equal 4 for the business. It does. 2 + 2 can equal 8 or 16. And so Floyd fighting Oscar Oscar was already a star, but Floyd fighting Oscar did mega business because it was a multiplying effect. And because Floyd looked so great against Oscar, it did a big rub-off effect. And now he became a massive star. And his image and his know-how with Haymon, he basically, that's the guy that guided his career, choosing the right opponents at the right time. And I don't mean that in a way like the right opponent, like people criticize Mayweather for fighting loser, picking and choosing his opponents win. I mean, he fought a killer. He fought up until the very end of his career. He fought a murderer's row, especially for a guy that was a lighter weight fighter and moved up. He fought a murderer's row of opponents for a while there. But he picked the right opponent at the right time to build up his prestige and cash in with as much money as possible. Jump to HBO Showtime at the right time. So I don't see. I mean, he's an amazing guy to follow for a business sense of how he's done the 2 biggest pay-per-views of all time by far with McGregor and Pacquiao. So it's not a mistake that the same guy did that. And on top of that, he has just a row of probably 4 of the next 6 pay-per-views as well. And the number of the gates and stuff as well, the 2 ties gates. I mean, the guy's business sense, what he's accomplished is way beyond any other fighter. But it's hard to see if anybody else imitating, because I think he came at a perfect time when there was the you could play the promotions against each other, go independent like he could. And on top of the pay-per-view business that exploded at just the right time. And before, I don't know if the pay-per-view business will do in the future, might do more, because every generation boxers seem to make more than the previous generation. Mm-hmm. Even, you can talk about it being less popular, but it's easier to sell and make money on the fights the longer it goes on, because we find new ways to market and make money. But there is a question, will that continue because of streaming and piracy? And he's a 1 in a million. He is Money Mayweather, like him or hate him.
He is lightning in a bottle, really.
Yes. I mean, McGregor is probably the closest we've seen to someone coming along, but McGregor, he's an MMA. He doesn't have the opportunity to cash in on his name independently like Mayweather could. Because of MMA, because the UFC has the market power, because UFC controls they operate as sanction organization, the promotion, all that together. There's no opportunity to go into business on your own like Mayweather could. I mean, even if McGregor could have got out of the UFC, he wouldn't have the opponents that Mayweather had, because they all would be locked into contract with the UFC.
Yep. Okay, Jon, so I lied. I have another question. I'm so sorry. We're going to extend this a little bit more, but I need to know why boxing promoters and the athletes are so close. It seems like an unbreakable thread. It's different in the UFC. The fighters don't go to Ari Emanuel and the board at Endeavor to work out the fine points of their deals. They work through a manager or through whoever the UFC has operating that part of logistics, I would assume. But in boxing, it's so much different. Why?
Well, in MMA, again, because the UFC has such leverage, you don't have much options as a fighter. So they dictate the terms. They tell you who you're going to fight, when you're going to fight, where you're going to fight, and you either say yes, or if you say no, you're put on the freezer, on the shelf for a while, right? But boxing, especially the big name boxers, because the boxers have options, because they can go to their promotion, because the promoter is dependent on that boxer to draw revenue for their promotion. The UFC has contracted revenue. They can, they make money no matter what, whoever fights. They don't even need specific fighters. But Top Rank needs, they need, especially Warren, their partner, the Queensberry Promotions, they need Tyson Fury to fight because they get money from that. Matchroom, Eddie Hearn definitely needs Anthony Joshua to fight. A big chunk of the revenue per year is from Anthony Joshua. Golden Boy used to be almost exclusively dependent on Canelo Alvarez. The PBC is a little different because they're not a promoter. They use, Goosen and all these other promotions who are basically hired by PBC or hired by the boxers. But they're all dependent on the boxers generating the revenue directly. Those fighters have a lot more power, and because of that, they have a different relationship with the promoter. They work with the promoter. The promoter, in many ways, works for those boxers. So the boxer and their manager get together, and the promoter, and they might all get together and say, "Who's my next opponent be? Who will generate the most money? Do I want to fight? If I'm Wilder, you're working with the promoter when you're with PBC, or you're Joshua. Do I want to fight Wilder? Or do I want to fight Dillian White or who? But Eddie Hearn can't dictate that to Joshua. He needs Joshua to sign on. And so Joshua can come back to him and tell him exactly who he wants to fight. And Eddie Hearn can say, okay, I'll make that fight happen. And that's what happened with Golden Boy. Ryan Garcia, he's the one that said, I want to fight Tank Davis. I demand it. Now, if a fighter says that to Scott Coker at Bellator or Dana White in the UFC, they laugh at him and say, you don't have me saying this. But when Ryan Garcia says that Oscar De La Hoya and Golden Boy, they got to make him happy because they need the money that comes from his fights. And so he dictated that fight's going to happen. Now, they should have been happy because it ended up being a mega fight. He gets 50%, and they get a small percentage of that. So they're going to make more money off that than they would normally. But that's the way it is, because the boxers are the primary movers in the sport. And promoters are important, and often, promoters I don't want to exaggerate boxers' power. That's the top boxers. A lot of boxers are dependent on promoters, and the promoter has the leverage over them still. But for the top boxers, they drive the sport. The promoters have to work with them. If not working for them, they have to at least treat them as partners.
And there you have it, folks, the long and the short of management. It's not the prettiest story, but there were some bright spots. There are some good managers out there. Do you have a name for us?
Well, the problem is I'm afraid to name managers because that means they know I'm talking to the guy.
Oh.
And so I like to pretend I hate them all because I don't want to let go that some of them, because the truth is some managers contact me. They share information with me. They want me to do stuff like look at contracts. And I tend to respect those managers because obviously they are looking out they want to know how stuff works. They can do better for their fighters. Other managers, though, when I know, do not even read the contracts. They're not aware of changes in them and stuff. And that, to me, that's kind of a signal to me man, you could be doing a better job.
Yeah. So there you have it. This is why we don't reveal names. Jon, what do you got coming up in the next couple of weeks?
Well, I'm going to start managing fighters. No, I'm not going to be doing that. Next couple of weeks, I'm going to try to get an article out. We'll see if I have the time to do it. It's the middle sweeps right now for my job, which means we have deliveries for shows for TV. So I'm pretty busy, but I wanted to write something about Garcia Tank Davis. But I had pneumonia the week before, so I couldn't write anything on before the fight. But I do have an inkling. I just have a bug about wanting to talk about, because I think it's so amazing and so interesting how that fight blew up so big. I'd like to write something on that. Besides that, we have a new episode of Show Money that just came out. Mm-hmm. And we have some, I have maybe a special interview going to come up. I was supposed to do it at the end of the week. I don't want to say in case I don't do it, but that's up. And then we'll have more Hey Not the Face podcast coming up.
And he did not win this week.
We're not talking about that.
He's not taking a victory lap around Care Don't Care Boulevard. He did not.
No one cares.
I repeat, he did not win.
No one cares about that card.
Oh, my goodness. All right. So there you have it, folks. You know the drill. Until next time, please stay safe.
It's not in the face! Thank you.